Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing arrays within JavaScript. So to create an array, we can simply add a constant, so we can say const array, and set this equal to the brackets. So this creates an empty array. And now I could do console.log of this array, and you would see we have the brackets, so we have an empty array. Then we can add values inside of it, so for example 1, 2, 3, and now you will see we log out the array with the values 1, 2, and 3. And one thing to note here is that arrays in JavaScript do not care about types, so I could have a string hello in here as well, and this would also work. Usually we don't want to combine types in an array, but we can do that. For now, I will get rid of this string and leave this as 1, 2, 3. Now, as an alternative to the bracket notation, which is what we usually use, you can also use the array object constructor, so I will comment this out for a moment. We can also say const array equals new array, and then this constructor, if it's empty, so it takes no arguments, it's going to return an empty array. If we pass in values, say 1, 2, and 3, it is going to create an array with the values that we passed in. However, if we only pass in one value, so let's say just the value of 5, what it's going to do is create an array with 5 empty spaces. So essentially just an array of length 5, but there's nothing in it. Now, having an array of empty items isn't very useful, but what we can do is we can call the fill function, and then in the fill function, we can add some values to the array. So for example, we can fill with zeros. This will give us an array of all zeros, which can be useful for some technical interview questions where you need to initialize an array to zeros, and then throughout a function, change that array. And it's worth noting that fill, while it does return the array like we see here, so we are assigning it to the array variable, it also is in place. So for example, I could do this on 2 different lines. So I could end this line here and do array.fill on the next line, and this will work the same way because array.fill is not returning a new array, it is changing the array that we called the fill method on. And finally, there is one more way to create the effect of having an array that is of some length but is empty. And what we can do is, instead of initializing to a size of 5, so I'm going to remove this, and now you'll see we just have an empty array, so fill had nothing to fill. But what we can do is we can take the array.length property and we can set it. So usually we don't want to do this, it's a bit hacky, but I wanted to show it. So for example, I could set this to 10, and now when I run this code, you can see we get an array of 10 zeros, and the zeros are because we filled the array. So if I was to comment this out, we now have 10 empty items. And again, we usually don't want to do this. We should usually treat length as a read-only property. So we might want to use it in the case where instead of this code, we had this array. So we could do console.log of array.length, and this will give us the number of elements in the array. So it gave us 3. This is usually the only way we want to use array.length. We usually don't want to use it to set a value, but I did want to show that it is settable. When we change array.length, it will change the length of the array. And we can also use array.length to truncate the array. Again, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but you could do array.length and set this equal to, say, 1. And now when I save this, you can see the array only has the value of 1 in it because the length was changed to 1. So all of the values after it were just removed. And if I tried to change the length back, they are still gone. So it's not like they're just being hidden. They are completely deleted. So if I made this back to 3 and save this, you can see that we have 1 and then 2 empty items. Okay, so now let's remove this code. And what I want to look at next is how to get and edit individual items in the array. So we use the same syntax that you might be used to from most other programming languages. So we could do console.log of array, let's do 1, and this will get the first item and it's 0 indexed, so that was the 2. So this is item 0, 1, and 2. So the array with the bracket notation of 1 got the number 2. And we can also set values in the same way. So I could say array at 1, set this equal to 10, and now when I get array 1, we get 10. And if I was to console log out the whole array, you see we have 1, 10, and 3. Next, we have some useful functions for checking if an item is in an array. So I could do console.log of array.includes, And what this will do is it returns a Boolean if the array includes some value. So for example, if I say the number 3 and run this, we would get true because the number 3 is in the array. We can also do array.indexOf, and what index_of is going to do is the same thing, but rather than returning a Boolean, it is going to check what the actual index of that value is and return it, and it will return the first one it finds. So if I had another 3, it's going to return 2 still, because it goes from left to right, and it stops at this 3 and returns that index to us. But we could also do last index of, and this is the same thing, but from right to left. So now this returns 3, because this was the last index of the number 3. So it's the same thing, but it's iterating from right to left. Okay, so next, let's look at how we can add some elements to the array. So we have functions for this. First, we have array.push, and push takes in some value that we want to add to the array. For example, I could push the value of 4, and I'll remove this 3 at the end of the array as well. And then let's console.log the array, and you'll see the array now has 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can then also do array.pop, and this will remove the last element from the array. So this is going to remove the element that we just added. So now we will have 1, 2, 3. If I called pop twice, then we would end up with 1, 2, because we have removed the last 2 items. If I remove every single item from the array, it will just end up giving us an empty array. No matter how many times I call pop, it's not going to throw an error or anything like that. It's just not going to do anything if there's nothing in the array. And pop also returns the value it removed. So I could do console.log of array.pop, and array.pop in this case is going to be removing the 4 that was just added. So this is going to log out 4 and then the array 1, 2, 3. If we didn't ever push 4, we would just end up logging out 3 and then the array 1, 2. Okay, and finally, the array.push function can also take in multiple arguments. So I could do 4, 5, and 6. And now you can see we end up popping off 6. So these got added in this order. And then we removed the last one. So we removed 6. And then we end up with the array 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so now you might be asking, what if I want to add elements somewhere other than the end? What if I wanted to add to the beginning? And we have a function for that as well. So we have this array unshift function, and it does the same thing as push, but at the beginning. I will comment out the array.pop for now, and you can see we end up with the array 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. However, I would usually recommend avoiding the unshift function if you can. The reason being is it is far less efficient than push. So let me show you why that is. If we have an array, so let's say we have the values 1, 2, and 3. Let's think about the algorithm to change this array to push 4. Well, all it does is it extends the length of the array and it adds 4 at the end. So this is essentially saying at array of array.length, we want to set it equal to 4. That is all the algorithm for push really needs to do. But what if we wanted to unshift? We want to add to the beginning. Well, we need to set this first value to be 4, but now we've lost 1. So that means we have to set this value to be 1, and this value to be 2, and this value to be 3. So what I'm getting at is that in most implementations, array.unshift ends up being an O of N algorithm, meaning that it needs to iterate through the entire array to push every value over. However, array.push is usually O of 1, or far more efficient at least, in that all it needs to do is change the length value and then add 1 value to it. However, of course, there are times when we need to use array.unshift, and that is perfectly okay. You should just be aware of the performance considerations that you should be having with it. So let's get rid of this example. And what I want to show next is array.shift. So this is the same thing as array.pop, but on the left-hand side. So I can do array.shift, and you can see we removed 4. So we added 4, 5, 6 to the beginning. Then we removed 4 because it was the first element in the array, and we print out 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. And again, array.shift, just like unshift, is going to be far less efficient than array.pop for the exact same reasons of when we edit the beginning, we end up having to move everything over. versus when we add at the end, all we have to do is essentially change the length. Okay, so next, what I want to talk about very briefly is the type of the array. So let's do console.log type of the array. And what we're going to get is object, which is not the most useful thing. So if I wanted to check if this is an array, we can't just use the type of operator because of the fact that arrays are objects. And most things in JavaScript are objects, so we end up with this issue. So with the arrays, we have a function for this. So it's going to be array.isArray, and this takes in any value, and it will return if that value is an array or not. So we can pass in the array, and we get true. Alternatively, we could use the array instance of operator, and then the array constructor, and this would return true as well. But the array.isArray function is usually what we will end up using if we need to check if some variable is an array. Okay, so now let's shift away from that. I want to look at how we can start deleting and replacing elements in the array. So we have this function called splice. So let's do array.splice. And what splice takes in is a starting index, so where we want to start the removal or the replacement from, and the number of elements we want to delete. So for example, let's start at index of 1, and I want to delete 2 elements. And now we can console.log out the array, and you'll see that we end up with the array of only 1. So it started at index 1, which is this 2, and then it deleted 2 elements, so the 2 and the 3. If I deleted only 1 element, you would see we have 1 and 3. So it started at index 1, and it deleted 1 element. We could also start at index, say, 0, and delete 1 element, and it has removed the first item. If I start at index 0 and delete 2, we delete the 1 and the 2, and we end up with just an array of 3. And then we can also pass in more parameters to be values to replace with. So if we don't want to delete, we want to replace, what we could do is, for example, I will pass in hello. And what this did is it replaced the first value it removed with the first extra argument. So the 1 became hello, the 2 was deleted because we deleted 2 and we had no more arguments here, and then we still have the 3. And then if I was to pass in world, we have now replaced the 1 with hello, the 2 with world, and the 3 stayed unchanged. If I was to say change the delete count to 3, we would end up with just hello world because we replaced the first 2 elements with these 2 elements, and then there was nothing to replace this one with, so it got deleted. We can also use a delete count that is smaller than the number of replacements, and we will end up extending the array. So for example, if the delete count was only 1, then we end up with hello world, 2, and 3. So we only deleted this element, but then we had 2 replacements, so we added hello and world in replacement of this 1 element. You can also use this to just add elements in the middle of the array. So for example, at index 1, I want to add hello world, and this will do right after the 0th index. So essentially before index 1, but after index 0, it is going to add in these values. But because the delete count was 0, we didn't delete anything from the array. So we still have the 1, 2, and 3. We just have the hello world in the middle of it. Okay, so next, let's look at one more function that is very similar to splice, especially in name, and that is going to be array.slice. And what array.slice does is it's sort of like the substring function on the string object, but it is for arrays. So with slice, we take in the starting index, and this is going to be inclusive. So for example, 1, and then we take in an ending index, and this is exclusive. So let's say 3. And then this is going to return a new array. So I could do const new array and set this equal to the return value of array.slice. And we could do console.log new array. And you'll see we get the array of 2 and 3. So it started at index 1 inclusive, and it ended at index 3, which is out of bounds on this array, but it was exclusive. So that gave us 2 and 3. So if I had just 1 to 2, all we're going to get is 2, because index 1 is the number 2, index 2 is this number 3, but it is exclusive, so it doesn't get included. If we had, say, 0 to 2, we end up getting 1 and 2, and so on and so forth. And again, this is not in place. It is returning a new array. So if I was to console.log out the original array, it is going to be unchanged. It still has the values of 1, 2, 3, as opposed to splice, which was actually changing the original array. Okay, so similar to slice, we also have this function array.concat, and array.concat is going to take in another array. So let's take in the array of hello and world. And what this is going to do is return a new array. So just like slice did, it is not in place. It returns a new array and does not edit the original array, and it combines the two arrays. So this array gets combined with this array because it's the array that we called the function on, and this array will be first and this array will be second. So you'll see we end up with 1, 2, 3 and then hello world, and the original array is still unchanged with 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now a couple more functions to look at. Let's remove this new array, and we also have this function array.reverse, and this one is in place. So it's going to change the original array, and it just flips the order. So you can see we get the array 3, 2, and 1. And finally, the last of these functions I want to look at is array.join. And what this does is it combines all of the elements in an array into a single string. So we pass in a delimiter. So for example, let's use this vertical bar, and we can console log out the joined value. So console.log the array.join value, and you'll see we get 1, the bar, 2, and then another vertical bar, and then 3. And this is, again, not going to affect the original array. And if we don't pass in a value here, we will actually just get commas as delimiters. But usually if we do want commas, we want a space. So you would usually still want to pass in the value and add a space after the comma. So that way we have the space after each comma before the next number. Okay, so now let's remove this code. And what I want to look at next is how we can loop through the elements in the array. So of course we could use a traditional for loop. So we could say for let I equal 0, and then we could say I is less than the array.length. And then we can say I++, and then we could console.log out the array element at this current index. So we could say array at index I, and this would work just fine. We log out 1, 2, and 3. But there is much better syntax for this in JavaScript. So most of the time, we won't end up using traditional for loops. The first option is the for of loop. So what we can do is we can say for const value of the array. So this is a for of loop. So the value, which we have to declare, we usually do this as a constant because we won't want to change it. And this is the value of the array that we are iterating over. And then we can simply console.log out the value, and you'll see we get 1, 2, 3. The one caveat with the for of loop is that you don't get access to the index. Of course, you could create an index variable, so you could do like I++ inside of the loop or something like that. So I guess we would have this at the end, and we could say let I equal 0 before the start of the for of loop. But if you need the index, I would just say don't use the for of loop. Okay, so next what I want to look at is a bunch of functions that are on the array object for iteration instead of for loops. So instead of this for loop, what we can do is we can say array.forEach, and forEach is going to take in a function, and inside of this function, we get the value. So it is going to call this function for each value in the array. And then inside of this function, we can do whatever we want with the value. So for example, I can console.log out the value, then add semicolons. And when I run this code, you can see we get 1, 2, 3, the same output as we had with the for of loop. And in addition to value, we also get another parameter here, and that's going to be the index. So for example, I could console.log out the value and the index, and you can see we have those values and indexes in the console. So the value of 1 was at index 0, 2 was at index 1, and 3 was at index of 2. And then finally, this callback function can also take in the array as a parameter. So I will say array here, and then we can console.log out the array, and you'll see we get the 1, 2, 3 array. Usually we don't end up using this because most of the time we have access to the array variable anyways, so I could also use the array variable like this, and this would end up doing the exact same thing. And finally, with most of the functions we are going to see, after the function parameter, we can add one more parameter, and that's going to be the this argument. Essentially what this does is we can use the this keyword to reference whatever we pass as this parameter. So for example, I could add an object here, and let's give it a number of 10. And now, if I go into this console log, I can console.log out this, so I'm just going to use the this keyword. And when I run this code, you can see the this keyword has been bound to the object number 10. And we will see much more about this in the video on the this keyword, but for now just know that whatever value we pass as the extra argument will be bound to this. That said, we don't tend to use the this arguments too often, and for cases like this, it would make more sense to simply define the object inside of the callback function. But there will be times when the this argument can be useful. Okay, so next, what I want to look at is the map function. And map works the same way as for each, except instead of simply running this function on each element, it is going to create a new array based on the return values. So for example, what we could do here is we could return the value plus the index, not import, the value plus the index, and then what we can do is we could console.log the, let's say, mapped array, and I will save the return value of array.map in mapped array. So const mapped array, set this equal to array.map of this value. And we could also use the this value if we wanted. So for example, we could also do plus this.num. And now you'll see we end up with this mapped array of 11, 13, and 15. So 11 because the value was 1, the index was 0, and this.num is 10. So 1 plus 10 is 11. And then we had the number of 13 because we had the value of 2, the index of 1, and the number of 10. And then finally, we had the value of 3, the index of 2, and still the number of 10, so 15. And just to show, we can also pass in the array parameter here as well. So let's just do console.log of the array. And it looks like the indentation on this line is a little bit off, so I will fix that as well. And you can see that in each iteration, we logged out the original array. Again, we don't tend to use this most of the time, but we do have this option to pass in that array. And then once again, this is not going to edit the original array. So I could do console.log of the array here. And to make this more clear, I will remove this console log, and you can see we log out 1, 2, 3 because the original array is unchanged. This is returning a brand new array. Okay, so similar to array.map, we have a bunch of other functions we can use, and the first one is going to be filter. And what filter does is it removes any elements from the new array. So it's creating a new array, but it doesn't add elements unless they pass a condition. So for example, let's return the condition of value is greater than this.num, and then let's set this.num to be 1. So now what this is going to do, and I'll remove this console log statement here, is it's going to only add elements to the new array that have a value greater than this.num, which in this case is 1. So we could say this is going to be the filtered array, and then we can log out the filtered array, and you will see we get 2 and 3. And again, just to show, we usually don't need the this argument, so I could just do value is greater than 1, and this would work the same way. I'm simply doing this to demonstrate the usage of the this argument. Most of the time, we don't actually end up needing to use it, but there are some use cases. Okay, so anyways, there are some other functions that we can use here. So first, let's go to array.find. And this is going to work the same way as array.filter, but rather than returning a new array, it returns the first value that matches whatever this condition is. So the first value that returns true in this function. So in this case, we can say found value, and then we can console.log the found value, and it is going to be 2 because 2 is the first value greater than this.num. And again, this is the value, it is not the index. But we could do find index. So instead of find index, then we can change found value to be found index. And let's console log that out. And you can see we log out 1 because the first value that was greater than 1, so this.num, was 2, and its index in the array is 1. Okay, so next what we have is this function called array.every. And what every does is it says, does every element in the array fulfill the condition? So return true. And then it returns a Boolean of that value. So we can say all pass, and then I will console.log out all pass. And in this case, it is false because of the fact that not every element was greater than this.num. So not every value was greater than 1. But if, for example, I was to say this.num is going to be 0, now this will be true because every element was greater than 0. And similar to every, we also have sum. So this is essentially saying, does anything pass? Is there something that passes this value is greater than this.num function? So this is going to be something passes, and we can log out something passes. You can see we get true, but if I change this back to 1, we still get true because there is still something in the array that is greater than this.num. But if, for example, I change this.num to be 4, now it is false because there's no value in the array greater than this.num anymore. And also, it's worth noting that with any of these functions, we don't actually need to include the parameters that we aren't using. So for example, I can remove the index and the array parameters and just have value, and this will work the exact same way. Okay, so next, what I want to look at is a slightly different function, and this is going to be reduce. So for example, what if we wanted to get the sum of the array? Well, the way we can do this is we can say array.reduce. So array.reduce, and then what we're going to do is pass in a callback function, just like we've been doing. But this callback function is going to work a little bit differently. So first it takes in an accumulator, and then after the accumulator, it takes in the current value. So this is the value that we are currently at in the iteration. And then it has the function body. And what this is going to do is the accumulator is going to be the returned value of essentially the previous iteration, whereas current value is going to be the value in the array. So if we return the accumulator plus the current value, this is going to give us the total sum. And then after the callback function, we usually also pass a starting value, which I will give to be 0. And now I will console.log out the sum, and you'll see we end up getting 6, which is the sum of the values in the array. Now, if I don't pass in this initial value, it actually will still work. What it does in this case is it skips the first iteration and instead sets the accumulator to be equal to this first value and only iterates through the rest of them. So you can test this by saying console.log here, and you'll see we only log out here twice in this case. However, if I put this back, we log out here 3 times because when we skip this extra parameter, we skip the first iteration in the function. Okay, so I will remove that for now though and go back to our sum. And just like the other functions, we can also add in an index here as well as the array. Most of the time, we don't end up needing these, but if we do want them, they are there. However, the one difference is we don't have the ability to pass in a this argument to reduce. So that's just something to be aware of. Okay, so let's remove this here. And what I want to show next is a function very similar to reduce called reduce right. The only difference here is that it is working from right to left. So it starts at 3 rather than starting at 1. So with our sum function, it's going to do the exact same thing. But what if we made a subtraction function? So we say accumulator minus current value, and let's call this difference. And then we can replace our sum console.log with this variable. So now if I run this code, you see we get -6 because the accumulator started at 0, and then we subtracted the current value, which was 3. So now we're at -3. then we subtracted 2, so now we have -5, and then we subtracted 1, so we have -6. Okay, but then if I got rid of this initial value, we are going to get 0. The reason we get 0 is now the accumulator starts at 3, and then we subtract the current value, which is 2, so that's now 1, and then we subtract this 1 from 1, and we end up with 0. But if I change this to be reduce, then we're going to get -4. The reason we get -4 is we start from left to right. So the accumulator is now 1, we are subtracting 2, so we get -1, and then from -1 we subtract 3, so we end up with -4. So the only difference between these functions is that reduce starts at the left-hand side and reduce right starts at the right-hand side. You can see this by logging out the current value as well. So I could do console.log of cur value, and you'll see we end up with 2 and 3. However, if I did reduce right, we would end up with 2, then 1. And if I passed in a starting value, so the initial value of 0 again, you see we get 3, 2, 1, and then with reduce, we get 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so now let's shift gears one last time, and I want to look at sorting arrays. So I will remove all this code as well as this array. Let's change the array to say 5, 7, 3, 0. Okay, so now if I console.log this array, as you would expect, we get that same value, 5, 7, 3, 0. But we can call this function array.sort, and this is in place just like the array.reverse was, so it is going to affect the original array, and we get the sorted value, which is great, and most of the time when we need to sort, this is all we need to do. But sometimes we want to sort in a different order. So the way we can do this is we can define a custom comparison function. So I will say compare numbers, and then I will simply define this function. So function compare numbers. And what this is going to take in is the first number and the second number. So this is comparing two numbers. And all we need to do is tell it, is the first number the one that should appear first in the output, or should the second number appear first in the output? If we return a negative number, so -1, for example, the first number will be the first number in the output. However, if we return a positive number, the second number will be first in the output, and if we return 0, it is just going to default to the order they already were in. So for example, if I just did return 0 here, then the order is not going to change because it is just leaving it how it was. However, if I did first number minus second number, we will get ascending order. And similarly, I could do second number minus first number, and now we get descending order. And we could also add any other special cases we want. So maybe, for example, I always want the number 3 to come first. So what I can do is say if first number is equal to 3, then I want the first number to be first, so I will return -1. And if the second number is equal to 3, then I want the second number to be first, because I always want 3 to be first. So in this case, I will return 1. And then in the standard case, maybe I want to leave it in this descending order, and now you'll see we get 3, 7, 5, 0, and I could change this to be ascending if I wanted, so I could do first number minus second number, and we get 3, 0, 5, 7. Okay, so that's going to be the last array function we look at and the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.